Whether you're looking for a convenient refresher course, or a way to earn your Pragmatic certification at your own speed, or the chance to take a Pragmatic course from your specific corner of the world, then Foundations on Demand is the solution you need. Get the same great content, tools, and templates our Foundations course is famous for in a flexible and easy-to-use online learning platform. Learn the skills you need to build and market products people want to buy. And earn your Pragmatic Institute certification anywhere, anytime. No more travel worries, no more time zone issues, just truly great training. Experience the new way of training with Foundations on Demand from Pragmatic Institute. Visit pragmaticinstitute.com/foundations to learn more.
Hello, and welcome to the Pragmatic Product Chat series, where we tackle the biggest challenges facing today's product management, product marketing, and other market and data-driven professionals with some of the best minds in the industry. I am Rebecca Kalogeris, Vice President of Marketing and Product Strategy at Pragmatic Institute, and your host for this episode. And today I am extremely excited to be joined by Ulli Appelbaum, author of the best-selling and award-winning Brand Positioning Workbook, which has been described as one of the best books on brand positioning since Ray Trout introduced the concept. Positioning is something just incredibly near and dear to my heart and near and dear to what we teach. And it's, spoiler alert for what we're going to talk about, super powerful and definitely something that everyone here listening to either should be intimately involved with today. And if they're not, then they need to be going. So I'm extremely excited to have you on, Ulli. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for this very nice and very kind introduction.
Absolutely. And for those who have not had the pleasure of meeting you before, can you give everyone a little bit of a background about who you are, what you're passionate about, and kind of how you got into the space you're in today?
Of course, absolutely. Thanks for asking. So, Ulli Appelbaum, I'm an independent brand strategist based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. As you can hear, I'm German, born in Germany, raised in Africa, in Europe, and moved to the US 20 years ago. And very early in my early university years, I discovered my passion for positioning. And a very cliche through the book of Rees and Trout, Positioning, the Battle for Your Mind, that immediately got me interested and started my career in advertising agency, various advertising agencies, first in Europe, Eastern Europe, and then the US, and mainly in the account planning and strategy department. So I was always developing communication strategies. And for many clients, we also developed positioning platforms, positioning strategies, etc., etc. Over the last 20, 25 years, I've learned a lot of tips and tricks. And when I started my own business now, 8 years ago, I realized that there is really not a publicly available how-to guide on how to develop brand positioning platforms. So what I was looking for throughout my whole career, and I got maybe through proprietary training courses with the different agencies I was with, I never found something that was available to the broader public. So I decided to write it and decided to do that when COVID hit. It was a good time for me to had some extra time. So I started to focus on that and I launched it early last year. And really, it's called the Brand Positioning Workbook. So it's really not a new philosophy about positioning. So it's not like Positioning 3.0 version of Ulli Appelbaum or my take on it. It's really tried and true classic tricks to develop successful platforms, to ideate enough ideas that are diverse and varied to then come up with the most relevant solution. So the biggest compliment I get from the book is, it's not very long, it's like over 100 pages, but it's a no BS book. And that's exactly what I was trying to go for.
Yeah, right to the point. Let's show them how it does. I love that. Love it. Okay, so you mentioned that you're like an individual consultant that goes and helps companies. Mm-hmm. I suspect, maybe I'm wrong, do a lot of people come and be like, hey, Ulli, we need help with positioning? Or do they come kind of with bigger problems that they're looking for you to solve? Like what?
It really depends the category. And I work with two groups of clients. The first group is packaged good clients, and they usually come up with assignments such as our brand has been in decline for the last few years, or a new competitor is threatening us,
Yeah.
or we are stagnating, or we're launching a new brand and we needed position. So that's usually with a business problem. And then the second sort of like bucket of clients I have is, and it started like 5-6 years ago, it's a lot of software companies in the B2B sector that cater to enterprise type customers. And that can be anything in cybersecurity, in asset management, in application development based on certain languages. And what they typically ask for, which is a different form of positioning, it's a messaging strategy, right? Is we have a new product in our portfolio. We want to understand how do we best speak about this product to potential customers. It is technically a positioning, but they're more interested in the outcome, which is generally 3, 4, 5, 6 messaging arguments that will appeal to potential customers. If you summarize the whole thing, you have a positioning, but they look at it differently. My experience is when you talk to them about positioning, they think it's like an esoteric exercise, that it's going to take a lot of time. Where the messaging strategies, it's something I can use immediately on my website, in my collateral, in my online messaging, etc. So it's just a perception thing, which I'm fine with. Call it messaging strategy or positioning. It's the same process I go through when I develop this.
Absolutely. Because I think in your definition of positioning and ours too, it is a very actionable piece, right? So I think to your point, that's why they're saying like, give me a messaging strategy, something I can definitely put in place. But for us, that's the whole thing.
Yes.
And I think what's really interesting, like some people know they have a positioning problem, but a lot of them, like you said, come because like their brand's stagnant or they're doing something new and it's not catching on, or maybe they know they're about to do something new. So there's a bigger problem that they're trying to solve.
Yeah.
That you're really helping to map out. The solution may not be necessarily, well, if they came to you, they probably know at least some of the area, but the solution of positioning may not be as obvious to some as the link to the types of problems it solves.
That is absolutely true. And what I've noticed is the positioning has something glamorous about it, right? It's sort of like the holy grail of strategy in a sense. But it also, for many people who are not familiar with it, it feels a bit esoteric, a bit abstract, sort of like a big thought that then I don't know what to do with. That is the wrong approach to positioning, to your point. If I look at a positioning and don't know exactly what to do with that or how that translates into, a campaign, into a messaging element, you're doing something wrong. And I try to avoid doing that, basically.
Yes, no, that's never going to help any of us. So instead of doing things wrong, let's talk a little bit about how you do it right. What is the approach you take when you get a new client in and you're going to work on the messaging strategy and the positioning?
Great question. So my process now is it's proven. I fine-tuned it over the last 5 years, and I'm focusing specifically on, let's say, B2B companies, software companies, IT companies, these type of things. So my first step is typically what I call the immersion phase, which is do a series of internal stakeholder interviews within the organization. And that is because, talk to salespeople, product engineers, customer support staff, obviously the marketing team, the CEO, the CFO, chief growth, whoever is there. And the objective here is really to get as much as a coherent picture of the organization as possible, understand the different point of views, but frankly also understand where potential resistance might be within the organization. Salespeople, I'm a firm believer in having sales work very closely with marketing, but sometimes there's sort of like a fake distinction between the two. But salespeople are always in the front line. They are talking to customers. They know a lot about customers. So these internal stakeholder interviews is usually very important. And parallel to that is we look at competition, right? Understand how they are positioned, how they communicate, what kind of products they have, how they speak about their products. And then once we have all that, we move into a first phase of customer research. And that is typically with prospective customers and current customers. So the current customers is really to try to uncover, frankly, is what the stakeholders of the organization tell me also perceived as such by their customers. So is there because the positioning needs to be true to the experience customers have. So if you have a developer positioning and your current customers say that has nothing to do with what you guys offer or how how I experience you have a disconnect, which we try to avoid. And with potential customers, and we typically do that in one-on-one interviews, we look for three things actually. One is, what are the main pain points these customers have within the organization that might be relevant for the product? and the product. If it's cybersecurity, what are the priorities? What stage in the cybersecurity life stage are there, etc., etc. So pain point is number one. And the reason for that is pain points will then be used in the second phase as a way to create relevance for the benefits of the product. So tying it to your pain points makes it more interesting to you. The second thing we look for is what are the corporate strategic priorities of the organization? And the rationale here is, frankly, if it's not on the radar of the board of director and aligned with the 3 or 4 core strategic priorities the organization has, the likelihood that this project will be funded and paid attention to is fairly low. So if I approach a potential customer, understand their pain point, understand how to translate my benefit to address the pain point in a way that makes sense to the board of director, you have a much better shot at convincing your customer to at least look into you further, obviously. And, whether it's like if the whole strategic outlook of the customer is customer focused or security, trying to understand how your little solution in the big ecosystem of your client helps address the customer focus point, you have a much better chance to sell. So we do this first round of research, get the pain point, understand the priorities, and then use that input to verbalize a bunch of messaging elements. So key benefits, how to speak about the product, what are the benefits that we can bring to life. And then we run this by a second round of focus groups, where we basically validate this. So we understand the priorities of the benefits, and we understand what trigger words work and which sound like BS, frankly. Sometimes like this is going to revolutionize the world of cybersecurity. Everyone will throw up when they hear that. And it sounds obvious, right? But there are way more subtle ways to the ultimate blah, 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 or better than everything out there. Those are words which people push back on, which rightly so.
Right. We end up sometimes coining phrases that to us encompass exactly this much bigger story, right? You're like, that's what we mean when we say transformation. But you throw that out at a customer and they're like, I don't know what you mean. And sometimes it's like a bummer because you're like, but I got really attached to that language. And it's so clear in my head what that means. But we're not building these materials to speak to ourselves. We have to do it to the customer.
And I've learned it's so correct what you're saying. And I've learned that the trick is really to find the right line between highlighting how you solve the problem, providing a hint of technical knowledge that shows, okay, those guys know what they're talking about without boring with technical details, and trying to really navigate in this fine line is the trick to positioning your brand properly and messaging it correctly. So that's a typical process. And sometimes instead of doing the second round of qualitative research, we quantify it. But the problem is, especially in technology, is recruiting these high-profile customers is extremely expensive. So, getting 10 to 20 of those is feasible, but that's already expensive. Getting 150 of them is horrendously expensive. So that's why we tend to focus on a qualitative exploration and validation rather than quantitative.
What kind of deliverable? So first of all, absolutely, everybody listening, you need to do the research both internally, which is going to help you understand the landscape internally, and how to roll it out, right? How to get people bought in. But 100%, you have to be talking to your market, to your audience, to potentials, and figuring out what they're going to do. What kind of deliverable? After you do all this, you've got some great phrases. What is that strategy look like? What is the thing that you hand back to them?
That depends on the scope of the project itself. So at the minimum, it's a document summarizing the key insights we get out of the customer research, because there's always a hunger for understanding how customers think, what their pain points are and stuff like that. Followed by, call it a strategy document, whether it's a brand pyramid, a positioning statement, a list of the key selling points. So typically it's this type of document that is the deliverable. And one thing I've learned is the truth is, because a lot of these large organizations spend so much time with customers and potential customers, they have a lot of hypotheses. A lot of them are correct. What they don't know is which one are the most important one versus the least. So there is no prioritization. So, a sales guy who has a great insight from a customer shares it with the group, and then the customer support guy says, oh yeah, and we have this other point of view or this other insight, and they're both true. You just don't know which one is the most actionable from a strategic point of view. So what this type of research allow you to do is also to prioritize it. So you know that, yep, talking about it this way might be interesting down the funnel, or once the key benefit has, or it's a great support benefit. So it takes away the guesswork or hypotheses or opinions and turns it into actionable facts, basically. And so typically it's this type of documents that I deliver. So I don't do any creative execution or anything like that. But typically what comes out of this process is, and my final presentation typically include the CEO and the key stakeholders, also the ones I pulled in during the stakeholder interviews. And what this gives is all of a sudden clarity, right? It's all great. We need to focus on these three aspects moving forward. And if they take that out and if they're aligned, then I think I win, because the clarity is one of the big things that the positioning provides, right? Or a messaging strategy provides. So you don't talk anymore about what are our benefits. You talk about, okay, how do we implement these benefits in our marketing, in our communication, and these kind of things.
I think it's super interesting there as well. Like you talked about, there's often you get sales material and it feels like they just threw up all the facts about their product at you. And I think you're right. Like they're all valid, but they need to be prioritized. They need to be filtered down. You need to be thinking about like maybe some segmentation in which ones you're throwing at me. I think that is an area where you can see. So I could see that your deliverable 2 gives you sort of a pyramid from two perspectives, right? There's the sort of elevator pitch, for lack of a better word. We all know what that one was. And then as you go down the funnel, you get more information, but also it serves several different markets inside the organization, right? There are some people that need to understand the tip of the pyramid, and that's their alignment. And then there's some, as you're getting down on those execution teams, they need to be able to see a lot deeper into your research and thinking, because they're going to have to leverage it in so many different ways. They can't just use those same words, but it's a really nice sort of ability to hit all those internal targets and allow them to prioritize that communication in the way they do externally.
That is absolutely correct. And another way to look at it is some of these messages are consistent and relevant for the whole organization. And then some of these benefits are relevant for specific clients. So who would speak about those more? It's, let's say, the salesforce when they have a client meeting. So, sometimes these statements, you typically have the top ones that everyone gravitates towards and finds as the most relevant at helping them solve their problem. But then and then you have the bottom lines, the least interesting ones, because you either use the wrong word or the argument is just not relevant. But often in the middle, you have arguments that fall in the middle of the road because they are highly relevant to 50% of the respondents you speak to and completely irrelevant to 50% of the other respondents you talk to. So you might be in a situation as a sales team where you are with a client who finds this middle benefit highly relevant. So there you can talk to them about that more in depth once you figure out they want to know about that, but you don't waste your time, bombarding every client with all the messaging elements. So there you can customize it and become way more specific in how you talk to them. But that is then not through communication. That is one-on-one interaction, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also think the nice thing about having that kind of North Star in writing is it gives you an opportunity to audit it going forward, right? Not like audit, how are we doing in implementing this framework, but also, it's a place to keep checking, because sometimes everyone gets really excited about what's going to be there now. And they're like, okay, let's make this change. But over time, the things start to spread, right? We're like, oh, I already said that. I want to do something different. And this gives us a chance to come back and make sure we're still going against that positioning. And of course, there's also going to be a time where the market may shift and you need to make sure that is still the right positioning. But having that sort of codification, I think, would be really key.
That is a great point as well. It really helps you determine, are the initiatives we are considering, are the partnerships we are considering, are the sponsorships we are considering, are they on strategy or not? And if they support and reinforce the brand positioning, they are. If they are not, they are not. And you're wasting money, basically. So you're absolutely correct. The way I look at it, Rebecca, is brand positioning. So I look at brands as associations you have with an offering, right? And every brand has maybe 3 or 4 associations. If the brand is long and established, it has more. But if you look at it as sort of like in terms of brand association that you want to build, which is basically what a positioning is, then you
Mhm.
can literally say, okay, is this initiative reinforcing one of these three associations we're trying to build? And that makes it very easy to assess, or is it not? And if it's not, my recommendation is either it's, well, technically, if you've done your job properly, you have looked at all the options. So you shouldn't come up with a fourth association that no one has thought about coming out of the process, then you did something wrong. But typically, if it doesn't reinforce one of the core associations you have defined, you should move away from it. Unless, as you said, the market changes significantly, a competitor comes in from left field and changes the dynamic of the market. But a good positioning should be good for 3 to 5 years typically. So
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's another good point you brought up, and something that we talk about a lot is that positioning is a true north, not just for your marketing and sales communications, right? I mean, it's you said it's associations, it's partnerships. Do I want to do trade shows?
mhm.
It's also like, do we want to buy that product?
Yeah,
Right? Do we want to buy that company?
absolutely.
Mergers and acquisitions. It's prioritizing where you're going to focus. If you understand
Yeah,
your main promise, it really helps everybody prioritize throughout the organization. And I think
absolutely.
that's really key.
And it also helps you when things go bad, right? A negative social media comment.
Mm,
If you have a clear sense of who you are and what you stand for, you know how to respond, what tone, what content, and these. So you know exactly how to respond when things go backwards a little bit, which is equally important not to mess
absolutely.
up.
But it's true too, even with sales losses, right? I mean, none of us like to do loses. None of us like to have losses.
Of course.
Uh, but I think it also is important to take a look at the losses in terms of which ones are the tighter, like which ones were in our hot spot where we definitely shouldn't have lost. If we're
Mhm.
losing a lot of those, that's bad. If in fact we're losing things that really aren't great fits for us, that's
Yeah.
a good thing
Yeah.
and could be like an intentional piece. So it also helps us make sure we're not panicking unnecessarily in that end as well.
That is exactly right. And why you're losing, right? I've had a situation where I had a client where I've been working with them for many years. We position them, they have a tremendous positioning, and 6 years later, they're still using the positioning. But the big problems they had is I did a whole onboarding analysis for them. So what happens when the sales guy and the client or the customer sign the contract? It's handed over to an
Mm,
implementation team,
yep.
and this company specifically had massive internal issues because either the salesforce overpromised or the implementation team said, oh, yeah, but we forgot to mention you also
Oh,
need to buy that $200,000 package to implement this solution you just purchased for $2 million. So, from I'm super excited to utilize this new product or service, literally within a week, the net promoter score went from 9 to 3,
oof.
basically asking like what the F is going on here. So then we had to rework and rethink the implementation journey to try to optimize the process. But if you talk to customers and they would be unsatisfied, you'd have to understand the problem is not the positioning and what the brand stands for. The problem is how the brand delivers the positioning in the implementation. And that allows you to separate the two and not go crazy immediately and say we need to change everything. So very important as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So one of the things about like an exercise like this, when the people bring you in or when you're doing your own positioning,
Mhm.
is like we said, it can really help solve big, gnarly business problems. That's amazing, but it's sometimes then also difficult to measure success, right? Because
Mhm.
it's not things. So talk a little bit about the kind of conversations you have with clients about how the kind of impact it will have and how you recommend you measure the success of an effort like this.
Mhm. So that's a great question too, because unfortunately you don't implement positioning overnight, and it doesn't typically lead to a boost of sales of 30% in like within a week of developing a new
That would
positioning
be cool.
statement. That would be great, but unfortunately it doesn't work like that. And then you have to separate it between positioning and the messaging aspect of positioning. So for positioning itself is my first, and that's sort of like a criteria I use, success criteria is if all the key constituents within the client organization have clarity and a united point of view on what the brand and the company stands for. That is for me the first
Mm.
success
Yep.
criteria. And it sounds obvious and it sounds easy, but my experience is literally in 9 out of 10 cases and clients I talk to, internally it is not clear that everyone is aligned on, what the real point of difference of the brand is, what the real benefit and the value of the brand is. There's always overlapping, but it's never consistent. So that is number one. Number two is the sales force, if they feel energized, because I don't do that directly, but often the positioning statements and the messaging strategies, as you mentioned earlier, gets translated into sales decks, right? If the sales force feels energized about this messaging and starts to give you feedback of first customer conversation based on this new language and this new positioning, you have a second check that things are going well and it's working. And then the organization typically needs a bit of time to change the language on its website, its collateral, its messaging, and all these kind of things. That usually takes a while, where it's difficult to measure success. But then ultimately, it's business success, right? It's customer acquisition, it's growth, it's all these kind of things, or these kind of metrics, which usually kick in several years, 2-3 years after you've implemented the message, the positioning. If you look at it from a messaging, then you can immediately go and test online messaging, right? You can check, if you have white papers that have a title that is now tied back to the positioning. If you have, an online campaign that tries to recruit people or to capture names of it, then you can immediately measure the impact of your messaging that is derived from your positioning in a much shorter time period. And then you can see whether it's click-through rate, download rate, and stuff like that. But the real positioning impact typically will take you a couple of years until it grabs in the market, it's accepted and adopted. That's another point, right? Is especially in IT or in many categories, you have like third parties like Gartner that are extremely influential in helping customers select software providers, right? The Gartner Magic Quadrant is sort of like the first stop of most executive buyers when looking at providers in specific verticals. So you have to convince them as well, right, about your new positioning. And they have to buy it and classify you the way you present yourself to them, as opposed to the way they want to classify you. So those are all things then that roll out. Sorry, very long answer to your question.
Good.
It takes time.
Yes, it does take time. And there's lots of different, as you said, lots of different variables that would make it take a different amount of time. So we talked about positioning, why it's important, what kind of advantages it can do, how you would approach it, how you might measure its success. We hinted at this earlier. I can speak for myself. I have made mistakes in this area before, and I know that you've probably made them, and I know you've definitely seen them with clients. So let's talk a little bit about those. Let's save some heartache for our listeners and talk a little bit about those pitfalls. And if one person avoids those that we did, I will feel very good about that. So
actually, I think I've been doing this for so long, I think I've made every single mistake in the book, which makes me very experienced. And it really starts with basics, right? Is thinking you need to position a brand without understanding who your customer is and what problem you're trying to solve. So you don't have a stake in the ground that says, this is what we need to tackle. The second problem I often see is also in the B2B world, but is that more even in the world of packaged goods, is a focus on the consumer as opposed to a focus on the human being behind the consumer.
Yeah.
And what I mean with that is, I may work on a project, several $100,000 with a lot of really smart people thinking about how to position a brand of toothpaste, right? And we obsess about that literally for 3 months, 24/7. And then I say, okay, the way to convince Rebecca is, and Rebecca has a life, you go about your life, and maybe if you're lucky, once a week for a second, you think about your toothpaste, probably right before you go and purchase because your tube is empty. So focusing on the human behind the consumer, if that makes sense, opens the way you look at your problem. How am I fitting in the overall world of my customer, even in the B2B world? How big of an issue is that in the world of issues my customer is facing? Am I at the top of his priority, or am I somewhere at the bottom? The reality is you're probably somewhere at the bottom half of it. So focusing on on the human behind the consumer is sort of like number 3. Number 4 is trying to develop a positioning statement in a silo.
Mm.
And then I said earlier, I try to reach in my stakeholder interviews to as many people as possible. The reason is to understand the different perspective, to get buy-in from those different people, because you need the buy-in for the implementation, right? And the worst thing you can do is you can say, okay, Rebecca and Willie, we're going to, disappear for 3 weeks, work on something on our own that's going to be brilliant, and then go back to the organization and say, voila, here's your solution, go and implement it. 90% of the people will say, thanks, but no thanks, it doesn't work for me.
Right. Yeah. The Matchbox solution is neither going to give you the best answer or the best buy-in.
Correct. Sorry for that. I think my dog is here in the background. I don't know how much you hear him. But
well, if you can hear, the dog is vehemently agreeing with Ulli on this. And what you couldn't hear earlier is my cat walked by in the middle as well. And so there was just this like random cattail. So this is very animalistic over here.
So, and another big one is also, I see that especially in the Midwest where everyone is so agreeable, is to develop a positioning platform that satisfies everyone. It's like, oh, boss, you want to add something about how great our customer service is? Let's throw that in there as well. So these sort of like committees are not good at coming up with positioning platforms. You need an idea. You need a clear. That's why I resist a bit. A lot of management consulting firm, they came up with this word value proposition, right? And the value proposition is really everything thrown in the mix, worded in a nice way. You want to be the partner with the best product and the best service at the best value for money that saves the world in addition to that and makes your partner significant other. You can't work with that. It needs to be an idea. It needs to be a thought. So those are sort of like 4 or 5 of the top biggest mistakes to avoid if you want to implement a positioning platform successfully. Develop it and implement it successfully. And I've made those mistakes over and over until I realized, maybe I need to change my approach.
Yes.
And,
we were talking when we did the prep call. I remember saying like the worst mistakes are the ones I've made before. And it's like, man, I should have learned this lesson last time. I know that this was wrong. And I think the human behind the consumer, I think we think about it a lot with packaged goods, but I think it's so true. I think people fall into this rut with B2B now. They just like, Bob didn't buy it. Acme Corporation did. Like, no, Bob did. Bob has like personal problems and reasons he bought it. And we often really dismiss that, I think, in B2B in particular. But so
that is exactly. Let me give you a quick example, if you don't mind, if we still have a minute. A client approached me not too long ago. They had developed a customer journey, B2B. So it's a packaged good companies, but there was also selling its food products to university restaurants. And that's a multi-billion-dollar business as well. Yeah. And they had developed this really sophisticated customer journey, very smart, 170 pages that no one understood and no one was using. So they didn't know what to do with that. And so they asked me to look at it and to help them sort of like make it more actionable. And so what I did is, again, internal stakeholder interviews, but then I talked to some of the chefs working in those kitchens. And what really came out is those are professional chefs that pride themselves. What they want is they want to talk to other chefs, not a salesperson that just makes checks on an order list. They're proud of their kitchens. Nothing makes them more excited than, having a salesperson that used to be a chef or that still is a chef and show them the kitchen, how it works and this kind of. So we boiled down these 160 pages into 20 pages, but the biggest implication was, talk to the chefs within those kitchen, talk to them as chef, change the structure and the makeup of your sales organization. Those are not sales agents or sales reps. Hire chefs to go and engage these people. And it's intangible, right? Because it's an ego, because then you have the pricing and budgeting issue and the quality of the product issues. But the thing is, if you, Rebecca, as a chef, proud chef, talk to me, Ulli, as another chef, we'll agree on price, we'll agree on quantity, we'll agree on quality, we'll agree on recipe and all these kind of things because we have this connection. If you look down at me as RG, I'm just another sales agent that's trying to push, 500 gallons of soup, you're going to look down at me and ignore me and then give me the, too expensive or I'm not interested right now spiel.
It's a level of trust, right?
That's exactly right.
It can say the same words. And it's very frustrating if you're a salesperson. You're like, but I said that. It's like, doesn't matter.
Yeah, and that is exactly right. Trust that you build by understanding what the triggers are at your customers, right? And what I've noticed in technology, you also have highly sophisticated customer journeys. But what really the core mechanism is really check Gartner to see the magic quadrant, who are the top players. Then step number two, reach out to my buddies that work in the IT department in other companies. Hey, who would you recommend in cybersecurity? Or who would you recommend in Java app development? Um, and with these two information, they're boiled down already the list of potential candidates, so that by the time they reach out to you and say, hey, a cybersecurity software provider, I'd like to talk to you, they've looked at you already. They've researched you. They've know exactly what your strengths and weaknesses are. So if you come in there and say, "Ooh, let me give you my spiel and my generic pitch," you're going to lose them right away. So understanding where they are and what their triggers are and what their perception of you is and might be helps you tremendously when you engage with them.
Absolutely. And I think it's true more and more every day that they've already done so much research and so many
Yes.
things. It's also one of the reasons the positioning is so important, because they're getting a numerous amount of touch points
Yes,
before they touch you,
that's
right?
exactly right.
So the more you have a stronger positioning, the more that kind of seeps through everything, the more they're going to be like, oh yes, that's what I've heard. And not
Yeah.
like, oh, well, you're really different than I was expecting.
That's the worst thing that can happen to you. And
Right.
that's why we also, as I said earlier, talk to current customers, because there's nothing wrong to say, oh yeah, we are seen as the leader on innovation and technology. And your potential customer says, well, I talked to a lot of buddies. They really think you guys suck and need to get your act together, but you are cheap. So that's why I'm talking to you. So you
Right.
want a coherence in the feedback your customers are getting.
Absolutely. All right. We talked a lot about a lot of different things today. Some of my very favorite topics, Ulli. If you were going to have people do two things differently tomorrow based on what we talked about today, what would it be?
So it's going to sound extremely simple, right? But I would take a sheet of paper and write down on the left side, what are the 3 or 4 brand associations your consumers has with your offering or with your product, if you're focusing on the product. What are the 3 or 4 associations customers have? And it's not a list of 15 wish list items of what I think my consumer would see me. It's literally the 3 or 4 you have. And then compare that to your competitors. And first, what you're going to see is you're not very differentiating. But then on the right side of the sheet of paper, write down the 2 or 3 association you wish your customers would have that would make you more appealing or more interesting. So it's really, again, coming back to these association bubbles. And you'll see you'll have 3 or 4 on the left, you'll have 3 or 4 on the right that are slightly different. And if you have that, and it sounds so simple, but it leads to such fundamental conversations with my clients when I show that to them. And what it also does, it allows you to really understand what is it I need to prioritize and focus on. Is my tone the tone of my brand personality quirky or funny and witty? Who cares? You know what I mean? It reprioritize what you need to focus on. And once you have that, then you can look at your initiatives in your pipeline and, as I said earlier, look at them and say, would they reinforce my desired brand associations or not? And if yes, great. If not, do I need to rethink them to reinforce them? And the reason I'm using this example is because for me, the brand positioning is really the sum of the desired associations you want to create with your brand. That's really what a positioning statement is. So just break it down. What are the associations I have today? What are the ones you want tomorrow? And how do I get there, basically? And as I said, probably your listeners will be rolling their eyes right now. I challenge you. Do it, maybe with a colleague, and see what you come up with and what ahas you get coming up with this very simple visual representation of your brand.
I think it's a great idea. I think it's one of those that sounds simple, but it's really powerful, and sounds simple, but will be surprising. And so I hope everyone does that, and then comes and tells us and be like, oh, you were right. Or
yes, and please send them to me so I can look at them as well and see what you came up with.
All right. Thank you, Ulli, for joining us today and sharing your experience and insights. It's been a pleasure.
It was a delight to be a great interview. Thanks for having me, Rebecca. I really appreciate that.
Excellent. And if people want to learn more about you, where should they go?
The best way is to probably look me up on LinkedIn, Ulli Appelbaum. Or frankly, you Google me, I'll pop up everywhere, either because of the book or because of my writings and these kind of things. But the best place is reach out on LinkedIn. I always enjoy hearing from people as long as they don't sell me the latest magical sales generation platform.
Oh, you get those too, huh?
Yes, I do. As long as you don't try to sell me those, I'm always very open to connect and interact with people. And I have a lot of people who reach out to me too and just have a question, saying, hey, this is the problem I have. What would you do? And I'm happy to spend the time on it if it's not 2 months of work, obviously.
I mean, it's something you're obviously passionate about.
Yes.
And so it's hard to sometimes get us not to talk about the things or
That's
share
exactly
things
right.
we want to talk about. So I totally, very much again, thank you for coming, Ulli.
No, thanks for having me.
All right. That does it for today's episode. Thanks everyone for listening. And don't forget to join us next week when we tackle another great topic designed to help you elevate your product, your company, and your career.